Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com, and this is a video where I'm going to do is we're going to review three concepts in React: props, state, and lifting state. What we're going to do is build, I think, always the greatest thing you can build in React, as far as just really kind of solidifying those basic ideas, which is a counter. You can never build a counter too many times in React. Every time you do so will help you re-solidify just the basic ideas in React. Okay, if you do hear my bird in the background, I do have a little cocktail named Wally, who is always, basically heckling me on the side. Okay, so on that note, let's create a new React project. So I'm going to do npx create React app, and we're going to create React app, and we are going to call this counter. Okay. So we're going to let that do that. Okay, and we have the counter folder already created here, so we can kind of start looking at it. Okay, wait for all these files to get created and generated. It's doing the thing. Okay, and what I'm going to do first is just kind of scope out what I'm going to do. Okay, first we'll create the counter. Okay, and then we'll break up the counter into multiple components, and then we'll do the whole lifting state thing. Okay, so a counter in React is pretty straightforward. So I'm going to assume that you already kind of have the basics in React, so you kind of know, like, this is a component, and you know what JSX is, and all that. That's going to be my assumptions. If not, you should watch my 30-minute, React intro 30-minute video. Okay? Cool. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a piece of state. Again, now the idea behind the concept of state, it's a variable that when it changes, it will update your component. Okay. So we'll create a state called counter, because it's going to represent our count. And we're going to have a set state function, or set counter function, that sets the counter. Now, in order for me to do this, I do need the useState hook. So I'm going to import useState, which is a function that allows us to create state from React. So I'm creating this variable, and the idea is that this variable counter here, whenever I change it, it's going to update my app. So equals useState, and then here I can pass in with what I want to be the initial value of counter. So whatever I pass to this useState function will be the starting value of counter, which will be 0. Okay, so counter is the variable that gives me this 0 number. And then if I want to change that number, I use this function. So what I'm going to do is we are going to create an h1 that shows us the counter. And then we're going to have a button. Okay, and we're just going to say add. And this button is going to have an event, an on-click event, which means this thing happens when you click the button. So to pass it a function, we do need curly brackets because we have to, be inside JavaScript mode. Anytime we're in the curly brackets, we're in JavaScript mode, so we can pass variables, write expressions, do whatever. So what I want to do is pass it a function. So I'm just going to write an arrow function right there. And this arrow function, all it's going to do is just set the counter to whatever the counter currently is plus 1. Okay, and this should work. So let's test this out. I'll type in npm start to start the server. Oops, in the wrong folder. So let me cd change directories into counter, because then you got to be in the folder with the package.json. So here I am. Now I'm in. So I'll just double check ls just to make sure that my package.json's there. Yep, there it is. And then I do npm start. Okay, and just wait for that to load. And there's my counter if I click on it. So now actually what I'm going to do is, before I even click on it, let's open up my React DevTools. So I have the React DevTools extension installed. Here's my component called app. Okay, see, there's my state, because I have one state, and that's going to be my counter. So that's for my counter. And watch what happens. I click add, and that changes to 1. And then my DOM reflects that change. Okay, and I can even change it from here. I can just be here, like, let's make it 8, and it updates my DOM. Okay, so right now these are my props, these are my hooks. This tells me like who rendered it. So this is like, it's the root component because this was this app component was rendered by React DOM render. So in that case, there really isn't a parent. And then this is the file where that component is defined. Okay, so I can use that to kind of figure out where things are coming from. So React DevTools is useful. And then here you can kind of like type in a search. Like if you had like a lot of components, I could just be like app, and I can find that app component. And then there's some other things here I've never really used. I should probably explore at some point. And then this kind of works like this thing over here, except instead of showing you which DOM element it is, it shows you which component it is. So I can be like that, and then it'll tell me, oh, that's this component. Okay, so that's pretty neat. Okay, so now what I want to do is that we see that anytime I use set counter to change the state, it changes the value of counter and updates the DOM. I can actually see visually that the number went from 0 to 1, then from 1 to 2, then 2 to 3. That visual change happens because this component re-renders. It's basically this function runs again, it regenerates the JSX, but since counter has a different number, that h1 gets generated with the new value of counter. But again, you don't necessarily want to put all your code in one component, because the idea is to like break it up into small, simple pieces that you could possibly reuse. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new folder called components, and I'm going to create two components. New file, the count.js, and new file button.js. So I'll just quickly define each one. I usually just first scope it out. So const button equals props. And then we're just going to return an h1. Hello, we'll just say with the name of the component, because I just want to test this out first. I just want to make sure that this is working. Okay, and then I export default button. Okay, and then I'm going to copy this code over to count, and then just change where it says button to count. And then I forgot one, so count. There we go. So now I'll go back to app. I'm going to import these components because, again, app is the thing that's mounted to the DOM. So for anything else to be visible, it's got to either be a child of app or a child of app. It's got to be somewhere in that component tree. So I'm going to import button from React. And I'm going to import count from, wait, no, why am I importing it from React? Yep, that's throwing an error. Because that's actually inside my components folder and a file called button. This is in my components folder in a file called count. Okay, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to just put them in my deal here. So count and button. And if I go back here, now I can see there's count and button there. So I can see count, button, count, button. Now ideally what I want to do is I want to take this number, this count number, and that's going to become the count, and this button is going to become the button. Okay, so that's kind of like the end goal there. So let's move some stuff around. I'm going to take the h1 out of here, Control X, and put it and replace this h1 with that. Okay, and that's going to cause an error because C counter is undefined. It's like, where's this counter thing? That doesn't exist because the state exists here in app. And I want to keep it there because technically I'm going to use the button to update the count. So I'm going to want to keep the counter here, and you'll see why in a moment. Okay, so I don't want to necessarily move this state. So what I can do is I'll pass the value of the counter down as a prop. So we'll just say counter equals counter. Okay, so now count is receiving counter as a prop, So now I just change this to props.counter because it's inside the props object. And see, now it's working again. So let me refresh. Okay, so now we are kind of good again. And technically this should be working still. Okay, so you see that's working. Because technically the button still updates the state and the state's being passed down as props. So see, like, the state here is an app. And then when I click the button, it updates that state. But again, that state is being passed to count as a prop. And you see prop then has a counter. So when I click add, it updates the state in app, which then gets passed down to count. So you see that changes as well. Because again, both components are being rebuilt. Because every time I change the state in app, app gets rebuilt. But inside of app is count and button, so they get rebuilt too. You're rebuilding everything from that component down. Which is why you generally don't want to put all your state in app, because you don't necessarily want every change in state triggering a whole rebuild of your entire component tree. Okay, but now what we want to do is move this button over here. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to app, copy the button code, which is this right here. Well, actually, not just this. Take that out. And then I'm just going to replace this button. Okay. Now the problem is it doesn't know what set counter is because set counter doesn't exist here. Set counter exists in app. So what I need to do is I need to give it that give it the set count function. Okay, it needs to receive this function. Now usually I'm pretty sure you cannot send the function directly. So I can't be like set counter equals set counter. We'll give it a shot. I remember at least it used to not work. Okay. And then again over here I do like props.set counter because it's part of props now. Okay. Oh, and then counter isn't defined. Got it. Okay. So then in this case we're gonna refactor this a little bit because see it like the counter is not here and I need that. So instead what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna create the function to update the count here. Because counter and set counter both exist in app. So let me just write that function here. That'd just be easier. So update will create a function called update count. It will equal, it doesn't really need anything. Okay. We'll call this update count add. Okay. And basically what this will do is we'll do set counter. It'll set, so it'll change the counter thing. And it will set it to counter +1. Okay, and this works fine here because technically in this file, inside the app function, set counter does exist. Counter does exist. So I can write the function here just fine. And then I'll just pass the function down as prop. So I'll just sit here and say like update count add. So in that case, what I'll do here in button, instead of doing this whole thing, we'll just use that props dot update. Oh no, it's a set. What did I call it again? Set counter. Let's just change the name of the prop to update counter. I think it's a better name so we don't confuse it with like a set function. So let's say update counter. Okay, so right now it should be working. Okay, so notice app doesn't have anything, but if I go back to app and I click on this button, I'm updating the state in app because the function was created in app and sent down the button, the function that updates the state. But the count, which shows this number, updates the screen. See, it updates. Its prop is updating because every time app is rebuilt, it's repassing down the count or the counter back down to count. So basically, every time app gets rebuilt, it resends down the props. It resends the function to button. It resends the count to count. And every time button uses the function, it updates the component, creating this nice little. And the cool thing is, like, back to reusability. Notice that like this button will do whatever function I pass in. So I could make this reusable. I could go back to count, or I can go back to app, create another function called update count subtract. And instead of doing +1, it'll be -1. Okay, and then all I have to do is just make another copy of the button. And then for the update counter function, I just use the subtract one. And now that button is going to work differently. So now there's two add buttons. We'll fix that in a second. But you see this first one adds, and the second one subtracts, because they both got a different function. Now I don't want both buttons having saying add. That's confusing. So this is another place where we can use props. So what I'll do is, instead of saying it add and hard coding the word add into the button, I can say, hey, we'll have a props called label, props.label. That's an example. Okay. And what I will do then is, for both of these, I can pass in a label. So we'll say the label for, because right now there should be like no label on there. So you see these two buttons have like no label on there because I haven't passed anything down. Okay. So see right now, both buttons are receiving their update counter as a function. That's a prop they're receiving. But see, button receives update count add. This button receives update count subtract as the update counter prop. Now what I want to do is pass them a label prop, so that way they have something on the button. So label equals add. In this case, label equals subtract. Cool. And now see, like they say add and subtract. And I can just keep making more buttons. I don't have to necessarily make another component. Okay, I could go create another function that updates a state. So const update count double, and then say equals set counter times 2. That's the new, because again, counter time, it'll take whatever the current counter is, multiply it by 2. That's what gets passed to the set counter function. That becomes the new value of counter. Okay, and then what I do is I'm just going to make another button. So I'll just copy this button again. And then instead of giving it the update count subtract button, I'll give it the update count double function. And then instead of it saying subtract on the button, it'll say double on the button. And now watch what happens. That keeps doubling. And then I can still subtract, I can still add. So I can keep creating more buttons that do different things. And I don't have to necessarily write another component. That's the beauty of React. That if you set things up in the right way and you think through like try to think through what things can be props, which thing versus what, instead of hard coding everything in your components, then what you can do is I can just keep using this button component over and over again, pass it a different update counter prop and a different label prop, and now I have a button that does something different. I don't have to go back and set up another component. And that's the art of React, trying to think through what can I break out into its own component and what things in that component can be a prop. So that way that component can be customized every time I use it. And then state should, basically state will be in other components. You'll have stateful components that actually have that keep track of data that's important. And then what it does, they pass that state down as props to other components. And as the state changes, all the components update. So in this case, the app holds a state, but who's rendering the actual visual count? The count component. Who's rendering the buttons? The button components. But the count receives the counter variable as a prop, and the buttons receive the function they use to update the state as a prop. So the way the count works and the way the buttons work are customized via the props, and they're all feeding off the state that exists in this case an app. But again, you can imagine like huge applications with lots and lots of components where states all over the place. So hopefully this clarified a few things. This concept here where basically we notice that like count is receiving the data, but button is updating the data. But it's all kind of happening here in app, because again, where does the state live? Here in app. This is referred to as lifting state. Because even though at the end of the day, app is not really doing anything with counter, button cannot update count, and count cannot update button. They can't talk to each other because they're siblings. They're in the same level. So we see here, they're all on the same level. They're all children of app. So in that case, what we do is we move the data up to app, so that way app can pass things down to count and button, and they can pass things to each other through app. So in this case, we've lifted up state. Count receives the count, and these buttons receive functions that update the count. Okay, so that's that's a nice little review of React, props of state. And you have a great day. My name is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com. Do check out my blog. I did post a very thorough guide of React on there. Right under here, like shift. Right here, the ultimate 2021 reference for React functional components. Highly recommend reading that. And also I wrote this article on just the basics of writing tests in React. Once you get comfortable with React, I highly recommend going to go give that a visit. But yeah, check this out. There are other React articles. So if I do Control F and just type in React, there are plenty of React articles on this blog. Okay, so if you need to learn more about React, I gotcha. Have a great day and enjoy.